Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to be talking about the next chapter in the ongoing dystopian future saga that is Lazarus, with Lazarus number 2. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in August of 2013, before we get started today, I do want to take a moment to recommend that if you have not watched my video on Lazarus number 1, that you do so before watching this video, because the story of Lazarus is a very linear narrative, and it gets real easy to get lost in the details and what is exactly happening throughout the story if you skip issues. So, like I said, if you haven't watched the video on Lazarus number 1 yet, I really would recommend that you do so before you watch this one. We can see here on the cover, we have the main character, Forever, featured walking down a highway in the desert. Overall, I don't dislike the cover. The problem I have is that she is very clearly hand-drawn and has a very distinct comic book appearance, whereas the background seems to be more digital artwork, and it almost kind of has a floaty effect where she feels like she's not part of the background, like she's pasted on top of it. And this is a problem that kind of happens frequently when you take hand-drawn imagery and put it on top of digitized backgrounds. Typically, the easiest solution to this is, once you've done it, then run the whole thing through a filter, so it basically gives it one type of cohesive feel visually. But it doesn't look like they did that here. And maybe that was on purpose, but I still kind of feel like she feels like she doesn't belong in her surroundings. Written by Greg Rucka. Art and letters by Michael Lark. Color by Santi Aracas. Cover by Michael Lark and Santi Aracas. Production design by Michael Lark and Eric Trotman. We begin this issue now in the Puget Sound, right outside of Seattle, Washington, where the somewhat secret base of operations for the Carlyle family is. I don't know how much of a secret is that they have a very large and elaborate compound here, but it is somewhat secluded and implied that most people don't know of its existence. We're then teleported inside of the building, where we see Forever exiting a bathroom, having just taken a shower, being spoken to by her sister Beth. This is Beth's first appearance in the comic so far. Beth, of course, is telling Forever that she needs to take her, huge assortment of pills and medications, and is also asking Forever how she feels while she runs a diagnostic on Forever's body to make sure that it's operating properly. Once again, Forever is the Lazarus of House Carlyle, and therefore she has been highly modified and engineered on a genetic level to be, I guess for lack of a better word, a almost perfect version of a human from a physical standpoint. But she does require lots of high-level maintenance, and Forever herself actually hates the term maintenance when described, or when used to describe her medical care, as she says it makes her feel somewhat robotic. Beth continues to run all of her diagnostics on Forever's physical condition while questioning her, asking her if she's having any issues with different sensations or whatnot. Forever continues to answer no to all of these questions. Beth continues her, poking and prodding. And finally, after being, satisfied with all of the answers that Forever has given her, she gives Forever an injection and then leaves the room, telling Forever that she needs to meet in the study in 5 minutes and that they are to have a meeting with their father. Forever then holds her arm where she just got the injection and begins to get dressed. It's a very cold interaction between the two of them, as they don't seem to be very close. And this is somewhat of a common theme with all of the Carlyle children, as we will soon find out while this book continues. Meanwhile, in the study, we come in mid-conversation between Jonah Carlyle and his older brother Stephen. Stephen is actually the oldest of all of the Carlyle children. The two of them are somewhat arguing about the steps that they should be taking in how they should address the attack that was levied against one of their facilities by House Moray. Jonah states that they're already at war, but Stephen states that they're going to wait and see how their father feels about that and if he agrees with the sentiment. Jonah then begins to mock Stephen, saying that he doesn't have a unique thought in his head. He just goes along with whatever the old man tells him to do. Stephen rebuts by saying that, he knows exactly what's going on and that he knows exactly what Jonah and Joanna, their other sister, are up to in LA, all of it. This infuriates Jonah as he tells Stephen that, basically he's going to completely kick his ass. However, this is broken up when their father Malcolm enters the room with their sister Beth, and Malcolm tells them that he doesn't know what this argument is about and he doesn't care. He wants the two of them to shut up and sit down. The two of them say yes, sir, as they very much know their place in the hierarchy of the family. Malcolm then asks where their sister is, and Beth says that Forever will be here momentarily, but he states that he's talking about Joanna. Jonah then replies that Joanna decided to stay at the Palisades residence in case Moray decided to attack again. However, Malcolm is not buying this excuse and tells Jonah to inform her that the next time he summons her to the residence in the Puget Sound, that she will come if she wants to remain a member of the family. We then see Forever enter the room as Malcolm states that it's time for them to get her briefing on the situation so that they can start determining their next play as it relates to their dealings with House Moray. We then see a hologram pop up from the table as Forever starts to go over exactly what happened in the facility that Moray attacked and explain how they were able to get in and what kind of damage they did while inside of the facility. Forever then informs the rest of the family that while nothing was taken from the Harvest One facility, that the losses to their security forces were very substantial as the infiltrating force was able to avoid early detection by the warning systems, and then brings up the picture of the man that we saw in issue number 1 who took credit for disarming the alarm systems. His name is Samuel Razales. I'm not sure how to say that. He was then executed for treason, which is, of course, their penalty for treason. Then they ask about his daughter, who Forever states that she wasn't able to find anything that would imply his daughter was in the know of anything or had betrayed their family in any way. She goes over a brief history of his daughter, stating that she showed specific aptitudes as a very young child and was taken away from her family, which is called lifted in this universe, and given a high degree of education and then sent to Stanford to study biotechnologies and agriculture, which is where Beth recognizes her name from, as Beth is a high-ranking official at Stanford University. However, they're interrupted when Stephen then questions if they, know for certain that the motive or what the motives behind Moray attacking them was. And then we see Jonah scream at him that of course they know what the motives are, that the Carlyle family cut off all their dealings with Moray a few years prior to this, and that Moray's soil is basically barren wasteland, as apparently they exist in a mostly desert, arid environment, and they require the very specific genetically modified seeds that are produced by House Carlyle in order to grow crops. However, we see then that Malcolm is a little bit perturbed by his son's outbursts, and he asks Jonah what he thinks they should do. To which Jonah replies, "Go to war." Not terribly happy with the answer that his son gave, we see Malcolm start to look off sternly into the distance. He then tells everyone to leave the room except Forever. As we see Jonah look back before he closes the door, obviously not too happy that his father is going to have a private conversation with the youngest of the Carlyle children. And he then asks Forever if she believes that the man who confessed was indeed guilty of what he said. To which she replies, no, she doesn't believe him at all. Or she didn't believe him, I should say. We then see Malcolm ask then why she executed him for treason and if she enjoyed it or took pleasure in, taking someone's life. And she states no, but he then asks again why she did it. And she then tells him that she had no choice, as Jonah had basically made the threat that he was going to kill all of their people at the facility if no one came forward. And then Malcolm kind of realizes that she was put in a position where, she could kill one person or she could kill all of the people there. And she took what she believed to be the lesser of two evils as he turns away and starts to look at his desk. We then see Malcolm look out the window and basically sigh to himself, feeling that Jonah has once again basically dropped the ball, and he just believes that he's somewhat foolish and not really capable of the leadership role that he is in. He then states that, he has 5 children, but only one of them is worth a damn, inferring that Forever is the only one of his children who he believes to be competent in their role. He then asks her to come over and take his hand and states that he has a very special request that he needs her to take on for the good of their family. Like I said, Forever is the youngest of the children. However, we're not exactly sure how old she is. And earlier when we saw Stephen and Jonah arguing, when Malcolm came in and shouted them down, he also implied that the two of them were in their 60s, which would definitely insinuate that they are much older than they look, as the two of them both appear as if they're in their late 20s or early 30s, which is kind of makes sense in terms of what the Carlyle family does with genetic research and also the alliance they have with another one of the families that we will talk about later in this book. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the other 3 Carlyle children are basically bickering amongst themselves. Jonah's really upset about the fact that the conversation between their father and Forever is going on for as long as it is, and then makes the statement that she's not even a real Carlyle. And Beth immediately cuts him off and tells him never to say that and never even to think it, and that he should never bring that up when there's any possibility that Forever could overhear any of that, as we're now being led to believe that Forever may in fact not be a Carlyle and does not know it, and that it's a secret that's being kept from her. Jonah asks Beth what's the worst that can happen. She finds out and goes ballistic. He then states that Beth and James, who we met in the first issue, he was the doctor who was taking care of Forever's medical treatment in the Los Angeles area, could just get together and make another baby, to which Beth just loses it and tells him to basically screw off as she reaches down and grabs him by the balls. This, of course, catching Jonah completely off guard as he doesn't know what to do with himself. However, Beth is more than just a little bit angry, as she takes Jonah's face and smacks it into the counter and then grabs a knife out of a pile of sliced apples and threatens to slit Jonah's throat. This grabs Stephen's attention really quickly as he realizes that Beth is in a blind rage, as he runs over and grabs her from behind around the waist and pulls her off of Jonah. Jonah then falls to the ground and, yells for Stephen to keep her away from him. He then jumps up as a maid is walking into the doorway of the kitchen. He then asks what she's doing, and she says that she's doing something for their mother. He then screams at her to get out and knocks the tray out of her hands as he turns to walk back into the kitchen, as we see Stephen still restraining Beth on the other wall. Beth then yells at Stephen to let her go as she's finally started to regain her composure. And then Jonah turns around as he sees someone in the corner of his eye coming into the kitchen and begins to yell at the maid again. However, he then realizes that it's not the maid, it's actually Forever. She enters the room and tells Stephen that he is to go back to the study and speak with their father. She informs Beth that she is free to leave and go back to Stanford, or if she feels the need to go somewhere else, she can, and that Jonah is to accompany her back to Los Angeles and that the two of them are to leave immediately. This, of course, doesn't sit well with Jonah as he starts to ask questions about why their father is not speaking directly to him and what is their plan of action about going to war with House Moray. And Forever then just simply responds again, where to leave immediately. Later on in Los Angeles, we see there is a huge slum tent city in front of what is left of the Hollywood sign. As we see the skyline of the city of downtown LA looks all right, but it is just surrounded by endless slums. There's around 1 million people overall living in the area right now, as we see a convoy of armed vehicles transporting both Forever and Jonah through the city, through what's left of parts of the city. And Forever kind of scolds Jonah at this point, stating that he should take better care of his territory and that he should have rebuilt more after the earthquake, implying that, of course, there was some sort of major earthquake in the LA area that decimated a large portion of the city. However, Jonah states that he only rebuilt the parts that were necessary to their family and that there was no sense in rebuilding the parts of the city that are, the living quarters of the waste class, which is essentially what they refer to as, it's the word they use in place of peasants, per se, in this universe. And kind of, it's showing that Jonah's a real kind of garbage dude. He believes that, their family and the people that work directly for their family are the only ones that matter, and really could care less about all of, what he considers to be essentially just worthless humans that live on the outskirts of the LA proper area. Jonah then asks Forever what it is that they're supposed to be doing now that they're back in LA. Forever says that their father has asked her to do something for their family and then says nothing else. Later on that evening, as Jonah returns to his large mansion facility in the Palisades, he walks into the bathroom to find his sister Joanna bathing. She asks why Forever is here. He says that he doesn't know because she won't tell him. This, of course, angers Joanna as she states that she has to tell them because it's in her genes. However, Jonah responds by saying that their father must have ordered her not to tell them, which does not sit well with either one of them. The two of them seem then to, kind of worry about what their next play needs to be. Joanna asks if Jonah Jonah thinks that their father has any idea what they're up to. He states that he doesn't think so, but he also tells her that he doesn't really think that their dad bought why she wasn't there. She states, though, that it's really of no consequence, that, they're going to have to execute their own plans on their own timeline. As we see Jonah leaning in really close and kind of getting a little bit too personal with his sister, implying that the two of them may be involved in some sort of romantic relationship. So that's unsettling. The next day, we see Forever moving through the slums of LA as she is on the mission that was given to her by her father. However, Jonah has sent his man Mason to tail her, as we see him hiding behind one of the buildings, kind of keeping an eye on her, but also trying to keep his distance. He sees her hand a piece of paper to a child standing in a group of other children, and then she walks around the corner. So Mason walks up to the children and he takes the piece of paper out of the little girl's hand. We then see Mason go around the corner to be confronted with a dead end and no sign of Forever. This, of course, makes him start to freak out as He knows he's in trouble if he loses her. He then decides to open up the piece of paper that he took from the little girl, which is just a note from Forever saying, Mason, if you keep following me, I'm going to kill you. This, of course, catches him completely off guard and also points to the idea that the only reason that Forever was even in the slums to begin with was to just lose Mason in the process because she knew she was being followed. In actuality, we see that her mission is taking her to the Sonoran Desert in Mexico, which is the homeland or part of the territory that belongs to House Moray. As she continues to drive down the highway, she comes to a stop and parks the bike and gets off when she is confronted by a figure in a long black coat who tells her that her father is either very stupid or very bold. On the final page of the story, we see the man's face and realizes that he is most likely a Lazarus as we see him carrying a sword on his hip. He is accompanied by a somewhat large contingency of elite troops who very quickly surround Forever as he states that she is now a prisoner of the family Moray. We then get to the letter section, which has a lot of interesting questions and they don't really get answered. And it's because I don't know if Rucka is the one who answers all of these letters, but basically they tell them that, like, we can't give you all this information just yet simply because it will divulge too much of the story that hasn't happened yet, which is fair. It's a very deep and complex narrative that they wrote. And there are a lot of questions, especially at this point in the story, that people are like, what the heck is going on? But, you know, as they state, they can't just give away the entire story in the letter section either. However, one thing that I find incredibly cool and interesting about the letter section is you'll notice these little bits of information and dots along a timeline that are basically giving the backstory to how the world got to the current state that it's in. And this is something that you could have really easily missed if you were reading these comics and just ignored the letter section. For instance, it shows here that Malcolm was born in X-45. So this is also something that's an important part of the narrative. They basically have a different way of measuring years and timelines that was created by the ruling families of this world. So as we see here, Malcolm Carlyle was born in X-45, and then it kind of chronicles a lot of his backstory, talking about how he went to college and met his future wife and studied in advanced like economics and different type of monetary theory and that kind of thing. All really interesting, and it continues on the next page. As the timeline continues, we see more information being divulged as it starts to talk about how Malcolm creates a large-scale investment firm that becomes very profitable, being valued at over $2 million in its first year of existence, and then starts to talk about how basically what got the world to the state that it's in was not because of war or global conflict, but because of global financial collapse. As more and more of the world's economies started to break down, some of the nation states began to panic, and then eventually certain nation states, I believe Greece and Portugal were the first two, essentially decided to sign over their economies to the Carlyle family and have them controlled by, you know, these private investment firms, private equity firms, if you will. And then their economy started to flourish. However, the rest of the world didn't all follow suit. There were some poorer nations that did, but a lot of them didn't. This is when China's economy collapsed, and it threw the entire world's economy into basically free fall, at which point there was some conflict between different economic superpowers that were trying to essentially bail out different economies throughout the world. And, you know, there were different governments being backed by different factions in terms of, well, different investment factions, different financial factions. But it wasn't like large scale war or anything like that. These were basically just localized skirmishes, but it was bloody fighting. And there was also a lot of protests at this time that, where the lower class of people who were struggling the most were starting to become violent and lash out. However, they were put down in a violent manner as the quote unquote ruling families started to assert their dominance and create a new world order. Prior to the collapse of all of the different world economies, at one point, Malcolm's investment firm purchased the Monsanto company, which is why they are now essentially the ones who control the world's agriculture. But they also have so much knowledge of genetic engineering. They then formed an alliance with another family by the name of Hawk, who were on the bleeding edge of pharmaceutical technology. They were able to combine these things. And this is what is implied to have led to the ability for the Carlyle family to age at such an incredibly slow pace. Like I said, his two sons are stated as, or referred to as, being in their 60s, while they look to be in their late 20s. This would also imply that Malcolm himself is really old, like well over 100 years old, if he was born in X minus 45, because the year X was the year that basically all the independent nation states dissolved, and the 16 families who controlled all of the world's wealth at that time were then the ones who took power. So they decided to use the term X as that year and, go from anything prior to X was X minus whatever number, and everything after X is X plus whatever number. And this is the new way that they delineate years. It's a little weird at first, but it actually starts to make a lot of sense the deeper you get into the story. It also talks about the point where the Lazarus program goes into effect, as Malcolm starts to talk to some very high-level genetic research scientists. And, you can see how he would take the scientific data that he possessed from acquiring Monsanto and then start using it to deal with human experimentation and, get to the point that we see the characters at now in the world as it exists in the present day. On the final page of the book, we get something called "And Now for This Month's News," which is basically something where Greg and Michael kind of talk about news stories that are of scientific importance and, cutting edge research. And basically, the reason that they do this is that they're using these types of scientific breakthroughs as kind of a basis for what they use in the story of Lazarus. And it's because they try to take stuff that's in its infancy in their present day of what would have been 2013 at the time this was written, and then apply it to, decades in the future and, come to a logical conclusion of where this stuff might lead to and how it might be applied in a world that exists the way that the world of Lazarus does. And on the reverse inside cover, we get a shot of the cover for issue number 3, which is called Family. And that was Lazarus number 2. Overall, I think it's a pretty good issue. It does a very good job of giving us more information and lore about the world in which it takes place without giving us too much. And like I said, the whole idea of taking the border around the letter section to give a little timeline blurb information to really give us a lot of backstory in a very small and calculated way, and essentially within 3 pages explain how the world got to where it is now in this story, is pretty impressive. It really speaks a lot to the writing abilities of Rucka. However, some of it feels like it kind of doesn't hold up. Even though it talks about like global financial collapse and all this stuff, the idea that nation states like that would just collapse and fall under the control of private equity firms seems plausible, but also Lazarus fails to take into account the proliferation of cryptocurrencies and where they're at in today's society 10 years later after this book was written. Crypto was still really in its infancy in 2013. And, now that we see cryptos being adopted on national levels by different nation states, and, we even see nation states wanting to create their own national cryptos. China, of course, has already done this. It kind of shows or alludes to the idea that it would be pretty difficult if, governments are using their power to force the use of one type of currency that can then be used to track, all of its citizens and cut them off from financial, abilities and take away their money. There's a lot of bad things that can happen when, federal governments have direct control over all of the monetary system within a country. And crypto's kind of a vessel in which that can be done if they ever decide they want to do that, which is pretty scary to think about. But like I said, this book, because crypto was still kind of in its infancy, doesn't really take that kind of stuff into account. But it's still pretty cool. I like the idea. It is cool to see that, someone took the idea of a dystopian future, and if instead of it being caused by, war and conflict, it was more caused by just complete economic collapse and, a few very powerful individuals then capitalizing on that collapse. But these are just my opinions. Your opinions may vary, and if they do, it's okay because everyone's entitled to their own opinion. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.